Hi, good evening, everyone. We should get started. Welcome, everyone, to the second lecture of the 2023 Division of Landscape Architecture Public Lecture Series. My name is Cecilia Chu, a faculty member in the division and also member of Docomomo Hong Kong, which is a co-organizer of the event tonight. Although we have already kickstarted the lecture last week with our first online lecture given by Professor Chua Li, I think many of you are actually attending this event for the first time. So I'd like to start with just a brief introduction to the theme of the series. So as the title, Assembling Futures, implies, the series is going to focus on future practices, especially on the role of landscape and heritage practices in shaping our environmental futures. Now, we are certainly all aware that all built environment practices engage with remaking existing environments for future use. But the precise relationships between how the future is conceptualized through different projects are still somewhat under-examined. How do the increasingly uncertain conditions of the present affect the ways we value, manage, design, and imagine the futures? How has the growing awareness of climate change forced us to reconceive the notions of nature and culture? How do different practices enact different future scenarios and construct realities in the short and long terms? And what kind of knowledge do we need to acquire in order to ensure that the alternative futures that we create today are better, inclusive, and more just? So as you can see here, we will have an exciting lineup of lectures engaging with these questions. And we hope that each talk will encourage critical reflections on the competing visions of building future worlds in the face of growing uncertainty and unfolding environmental crisis in our time. So let me now introduce our speakers tonight. Dr. Montira Horayangura Unakul, who is a professional expert in the safeguarding and sustainable development of cultural heritage. Dr. Unakul is a professional officer in the culture unit of UNESCO Bangkok, Thailand. She's also an advisor to Southeast Asian Regional Center for Archaeology and Fine Arts and Siamese Heritage Trust. She has bachelor degrees in economics and East Asian studies from Harvard University, master degrees in architecture and city planning from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in urban and regional planning from Chulalongkorn University. Among her many, many achievements, I have seen a very long CV, Dr. Unakul has guided the development of UNESCO's new competence framework for cultural heritage management and plans for managing heritage, tourism, and disaster risk at various World Heritage properties. She also oversaw all aspects of running the UNESCO Asia Pacific Awards for Cultural Heritage Conservation, something that I think that we are quite familiar with, and provided technical oversights for the program. Over the years, she has been invited to deliver many lectures and run workshops related to heritage and sustainable development across the Asian region. She has also authored and edited a substantial number of edited volumes on cultural heritage and have received many medals and honors for her service and achievements in the field. Finally, I'd just like to add a personal anecdote. I first came to know Montira through affiliation with the Department of Architecture at UC Berkeley, where we actually shared the same advisor, although we did not really overlap. I think she just graduated when I just came. I and many of my colleagues always look up to Montira, not only because of her achievements, but also her incredible work ethics and tireless dedication to advancing her cause. And importantly, we see her work as representing exactly the kind of interdisciplinarity that is so needed in today's built environment practice, in linking issues of heritage and sustainability with landscapes, planning, and architecture. And I believe that such emphasis will in some way come through in her lecture tonight, which is titled Heritage, Time Sustainability, a Territorial View. So please welcome Dr. Unakul.
So good evening, and thank you very much to everyone for coming during dinner time. I know it's a difficult choice to make, come listen to a lecture or go have dinner. So thank you, I appreciate your being here. And thank you to Cecilia for her fulsome remarks and kind introduction. I had sent her a 2-line CV and she's like, can you send me a slightly longer one? So I sent her the 19-page version, and you can see what that has transpired into. So it's a pleasure to be here again. I was here wearing my UNESCO hat maybe 4 years ago or something, in this very room, in fact, for a 3-day meeting. And so it's nice to be back today talking about issues that are very near to my heart. Halfway through my PhD in urban planning, I realized that I really should have done it in landscape architecture. I felt like that was my spiritual home that I had sort of missed the boat on, but by that point, the boat had sailed, and here I am, PhD in planning. So, okay. Do I just, my slides are magically hiding behind the poster? Okay. There we go. But for those of you who are interested in the other speakers, Natalia will be sharing with us a brief introduction after my talk. So today I'm here to speak to you about sustainability, which I know is sort of an overused buzzword, but I think it reflects really the core of everything that we do, and I think reflects very much the issues that came up during this afternoon's studio discussion with Ivan's students, looking at Ho Chi Minh City and looking at various aspects of sustainability, whether it's economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, or social sustainability, and the intersection of all of these three. Bearing in mind that, the 2030 agenda, which is, the framework for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, defines progress towards sustainability as moving forward on all three fronts altogether. So if you are doing very well on economic sustainability, but you've neglected environmental sustainability, then that's not very sustainable, in the very definition of the word. And so today, how do we, translate these sort of lofty goals into action on the ground? And I open with a slide from Ayutthaya in 2011. Thailand had seen the worst flooding it had ever faced for a number of decades. And Ayutthaya is the second capital of Thailand. It's located about 70 kilometers north of Bangkok. As you know, for anyone who's been, it's a ruined city. It was abandoned after it was sacked. And so now it's a collection of brick monuments, mostly temples, and a bit of palatial compound. And it's located next to, it's on an island surrounded by rivers. But when I went in 2011, this is what it was like. And normally, Ayutthaya looks like this. Obviously, you can walk around and it's a collection of monuments. But that time that I went with a group of experts that the Thai government had asked us to assemble to conduct an assessment of the flood situation and to start preparing recovery measures and then think about future mitigation, we actually had to go around by boat. So the reason I'm not in this picture is because I'm on another boat. So, so as we paddled around, this monument, which was engulfed eventually by almost 2 meters of water for the better half of a month and a half. And this was unprecedented. I mean, flooding is seasonal and normal in lowland deltaic areas of Southeast Asia. You expect it to flood every year during the rainy season. Flooding is neither alarming or a surprise, but for flooding to stay for well over 6 weeks is alarming and a surprise. And so it became a natural disaster compounded by human ineptness, basically. And so this particular temple, Wat Chai Wachanaram, is located actually not in the historic island, but to the southeast on the opposite side of the river. So it sits right next to the Chao Phraya River, which anyone who knows Thailand will know it's the main river that bisects Thailand down the middle. And so obviously from a flood vulnerability point of view, it is quite vulnerable because it's located right next to the river, which perennially floods. And so as you can see in the foreground, there's this stainless steel erectable panels that are mounted every time it's flood season or that there's imminent high water about to engulf the site. And so that's the kind of mitigation measure that has been put in place for this particular temple. But if one looks at an aerial view, that's the temple in the midground, you'll see that that's the river. But you'll also see that, in fact, that year where I had to paddle around in a rowboat, in fact, the stainless steel defenses held out. So they were not breached. But what happened was that the water engulfed everything around it and then eventually came in through the back. And then not long after that, the whole thing was underwater. So you could not tell where the river began and where the river ended by that point. And so all the pumping that they were frantically doing to drain off the water was also for naught, because you don't know where you could have possibly pumped the water to, because it had become a sea. And so this, raises a lot of questions, and it did at the time as well, about how do you deal with mitigating such a disaster? How do you respond to it, first of all, at the initial outset? But then what's the long-term view in terms of how do you deal with it as a possibly perennial concern? Bearing in mind that this wasn't even necessarily like a 10,000 year return period flood. I mean, it was not like of that scale necessarily, but meaning to say that it is possible that it will happen again in the foreseeable future. And so what lessons were learned from this incident, is the question. The flood hazard has been mapped, sort of. So we did a project with the UNESCO Institute of Hydrology in Delft, the Netherlands, and in cooperation with the Thai Hydroinformatics Institute. And the flood risk mitigation study, of course, characterized what the flood risk at Ayutthaya was. As you can see, using the benchmark of the level of flooding that occurred in 2011, there would indeed be a quite high level of hazard induced by the flood, mostly because Ayutthaya, of course, is low-lying. And the history of Ayutthaya is that, the floodwater was intentionally part of the design of the city and its defenses to allow the city to be surrounded by a hinterland of flooding, both for agricultural purposes, but also for defensive purposes as well. And so as recently as, mid this century, when we did this flood risk mitigation study and interviewed residents, middle-aged residents who remember their childhood growing up in the city and remember, seasonal flooding, actually found it as moments of joy. Flooding would be, school was called off, you got to fish under your house, you got to swim, and of course water quality was very different back then. And so it was not a cause for dismay, or alarm. And surprisingly, when we surveyed, community members who live in this area, they also said that actually they didn't quite mind the floods as such, as long as the government would provide support, in terms of relief supplies or emergency food or whatnot. Many people, especially those who lived along the riverside, actually have boats and so forth. So they were somehow attuned to living in that context. But modern day contemporary urban management is not attuned, to dealing with this. And we could see that, the scale of the problem was well beyond the historic island that we were looking at just now. And this is imagery showing what it was like. Ayutthaya in the left-hand image is circled in orange. So you can see that it was the entire Jalpuya River basin, had been inundated. And this was because of a confluence of a number of storms that came in back to back, but it was also compounded by the fact that water release from dams had been badly timed. And so they began to release water too late. And so by the time the ultimate storms came in, plus they had to now release water, it just, became this massive flood, which had nowhere to go, so it was everywhere. So So when you think about the floodplain as being something that would have, yes, pervious surfaces and would have had that capacity to absorb this floodwater, it was sort of beyond the scale that it could be absorbed. And so as a result, it was not just temples that were inundated, but it was, the town, the entire city was inundated, and not just the entire city, but the entire province and multiple provinces at that. So people were commuting by boat, as you can see here, along like the main thoroughfare. And industrial estates and other types of areas were also submerged as well. And these industrial estates, in a sense, are part of the problem, because a lot of the conversion of land, which previously had been agricultural land, or at least had been land with absorptive capacity to handle water overflow, had been converted over time into industrial estates. Particularly around Ayutthaya, you'll see that there's quite a number of them, precisely because of its proximity to Bangkok, and so it became kind of like an industrial development zone in an area which, historically speaking, sort of taking a geological time frame, had always been floodland, or land that was prone to flooding. And so the wisdom of taking that land, which I think also echoed the discussion today with Ho Chi Minh City, taking land which has an ecosystem function of absorbing all of that water, and then hard paving it, and then not only that, but then having to protect it, because this is a huge generator of economic resources for the country. And so then having to protect it by then hardening river banks and channelizing the river and doing all of that kind of management, which actually only compounds the problem, then becomes this sort of vicious circle. And so after this incident, all of the industrial estates, erected very high walls around their perimeter in order to protect themselves as little islands of dryness. And as a result, where is all that water going? It's going to places like the historic city of Ayutthaya, which, of course, has not the resources to do that, and would be incompatible with the historic sort of archaeological setting to put that kind of defensive barrier up. And so when we look back at Ayutthaya as a historic urban construct, you'll see that it was very much an engineered landscape, a combination between natural rivers. So the historic island, as you can see, is surrounded on all sides by waterways. And to your left, on the western edge, is the Chao Phraya River that meanders around and goes to the south to Bangkok. On the right is the Basat River, and then on the top, the Lokbri River. And actually, the bit at the top on the northern perimeter of the island was actually a canal, which over time grew and grew and became, now functions sort of as a river. And so, and you'll see that the whole hydrological system, both of man-made canals as well as of natural waterways, extends well beyond the historic island into this this kind of peripheral hinterlands of mostly agricultural areas. At least it was that way in the past. And so this is the micro context of Ayutthaya, but if you zoom out and you look at where it is located vis-a-vis the whole Chao Phraya River basin, trying to not to draw. Is this it? Okay, so this main line, this trunk line here, is the Chao Phraya River basin, and this bit here is Ayutthaya. So you'll see that this entire thing from Ayutthaya, and in fact well above Ayutthaya downwards, was the original delta area and the fan terrace, this alluvial plain of the Chao Phraya basin, which over time, as sedimentation added more and more land, also added sort of newer delta areas. And so this area is called the delta high, sort of a meter high, being a meter above mean sea level. And then the portion that is adjacent to here, which is the Gulf of Thailand, is basically at sea level, and actually is being reclaimed by the sea as we speak. And so that's the larger physiographic context of Ayutthaya. And so and provides kind of room to pause in thinking about contemporary planning regimes, which have now taken over the planning of the not just the Uchiha, but in fact this whole delta region as well. So if we take a step back and we look at Uchiha, what has this contemporary planning regime led us to? We'll see once again here the historic island, this sort of little goldfish shape here. So on the left-hand side of the island, it's the area which is protected as a historic park. And so that's where the most, but certainly not all by a stretch, of the archaeological structures are maintained and protected. And so this is what coincides with the World Heritage designation as well. But you can see that on the eastern side of the island, and in fact beyond, it has become very urbanized, commercial, residential uses, quite not very high, but very dense. And but historically, this whole thing was the capital city. And historically, the network of roads, canals, temples, and so forth was extended throughout the whole island, and then indeed beyond. And the area to the east of Ayutthaya and area to the south of Ayutthaya are actually historic settlements that predate Ayutthaya as it was in its heyday. And so all of this, in a sense, is an archaeological or a historic or a cultural landscape which is of significance, certainly at the national level, if not more than that. And so the World Heritage designation, as you can see here, has allowed for the historic island to be preserved exactly in this bifurcated manner. So on the left-hand side, if you go, you can admire the sunset on Elephant Back in sort of these pristinely manicured archaeological grounds. And that in itself is sort of, a cause for contention that perhaps is not the point of today's discussion. But on the eastern side of the island, you'll see, it's like this. It's like any other secondary Thai town. So 7-Elevens and shop houses and parking and so forth. And so it's sort of like a tale of two cities in one city due to different planning regimes and different levels of protection. Interestingly enough, while this looks the way it actually is, by the letter of the law, also designated as National Archaeological Zone under national level protection. So, you look at it and you sort of scratch your head, well, how could this possibly be, protected as a National Archaeological Zone when it is, when it is what it is, as you see. And so the flooding incident really raised this question about how do you manage an integrated territory, at a territorial scale? Because clearly the flood raised questions about managing a flood at the level of a temple, or managing a flood at the level of a quarter, or at a level of a town. Water respects no administrative boundaries. And so we could see that this massive scale of problem really required a rethink. And to the credit of the Thai government, they did, as a result of the flood, finally put in place a national organization, the Office of National Water Resource Management, which is meant to coordinate across different silos of government in order to put together things like a national plan for water management and floods and droughts and so forth. And so this is sort of maybe the main institutional response that has come out of this flood, which happened now over a decade ago. But unfortunately, at the meso level, or at the micro level, the lessons that could have been learned from the disaster, in fact, were not. So this risk study that we did characterized the root cause of the flooding as, well, one is the topography of the basin itself. We know it's low-lying, we know it's prone to flooding, we know it floods seasonally. I mean, so that's not, something new. The extreme hydrometeorological conditions, these multiple storms, compounded by, and then finally, the lack of proper risk mitigation policies and measures. And so that speaks to the inept management of the dam runoff. It speaks to the inappropriate planning measures. It speaks to also the lack of specific risk mitigation measures that were there on the ground. So when we did a kind of a study of the risk mitigation measures that were in place, they were sort of the classical, focus on saving lives, et cetera, type of risk management measures. And there were actually, say, despite the fact that this is a World Heritage Site, nothing in place in the existing risk, regimes concerning culture, concerning heritage. And so they had to make everything up on the spot. So they had to like bring in pumps and to try to drain the site. They had to bring in boats. They had to, it was all very much on the fly, and it was all very reactive, and it was all very insubstantial, compared with the scale of the problem that obviously faced the site. And so, sadly, 10 odd years down the road, every time flooding is in the headlines, and it is almost every year around October or November, the response is still, oh, okay, not to worry, we're protecting the temples. And you get this kind of picture. It's this sort of site-by-site, point-based response. We're gonna, construct these temporary dams and levees and things in order to protect this bit or that bit. And so where has that landscape scale problem gone in terms of, a proposition? Where is the landscape scale response to this problem, which is obviously, intractable and unsolvable at this scale? So there are obviously, part of it is sort of, the problem of administrative silos, right? So the people who are in charge of the temples and the monuments will enact this kind of response because that's sort of within their remit. But who are all the other people who are involved? Like what happened to the Ayutthaya municipality? Well, the response of the mayor was that he was going to protect his town by purchasing from Germany a quite expensive system of demountable steel plates that could be put up and then taken down at the end of every season. And oh, by the way, it's very expensive, and I'm sure someone will profit from that as well, not just in Germany. So that was his response. It was also, I'm the mayor, so I can think about it at the scale of my city. And then the province, put in place, well, the disaster risk management unit will take into account things that are maybe a little bit beyond saving human lives. But what about the Royal Irrigation Department? What about, the Department of Public Works and Town and Country Planning? What about all these other entities that are somehow, in the constellation of involved parties for dealing with, these issues? Unfortunately, there really hasn't been a novel response, even despite these lessons learned. And so we still have quite uncoordinated, point-based types of response measures, and not even mitigation, but still response measures. And so we did, in fact, as a culmination of this study that UNESCO undertook with the government and these Dutch experts, did in fact propose that there should be multi-scalar approach to dealing with this problem. So both at a regional scale as well as a local scale. And this combination of measures would be the one that would at least make a dent in terms of solving the problem. And so at regional scale, we have to again take a step backwards and reimagine that image that I showed you with basically the entire central delta of Thailand flooded. What was proposed was to undertake 2 bypass canals to the east and to the west of the Chao Phraya River in order to create alternative channels for floodwater coming from the north to be diverted, and thereby avoiding the metropolitan areas that are clustered around the main river trunk line. And then secondly, and we zoom in and we look at the Ayutthaya bypass channel that would be running to the west of the city in what is still primarily an agricultural area. And so in fact, as part of this new national water management mechanism, in fact, this bypass is actually coming to pass. Secondly, but these regional measures would only work if they were undertaken in concert also with localized measures as well. And so there were a number of proposals that were put forth. So one is to increase capacity of retention areas and detention areas. So if you look at the map of Uchiha, a historic city, it actually has a number of historic ponds that were in place. And so how to increase their capacity as in order to be able to temporarily hold water, or maybe even permanently hold water. By the topography of the lay of the lands, if you look at that goldfish again, it's the southwest corner, actually, which is naturally the lowest area of the goldfish. And so the hydrological engineers said, okay, by the topography, this area should also be a temporary detention area in times of flooding. And the archaeologists were so shocked because that's where the collection of, some of the most important royal tombs were. They're saying, no, absolutely, you cannot, intentionally say that we're going to flood our royal, stupas with flood water, even temporarily. So there was a bit of a face-off between the hydrological engineers and the archaeologists. But the principle of the matter still remain the same. So there are, in fact, potential for this, and actually, the government actually did end up investing in dredging ponds, but they did it purely for as a landscape beautification project, like with a whole different impetus and a whole different set of funding and planning and so forth. But when pointed out to them that, oh, and by the way, having done that, you've also increased your, water retention capacity, then they began to sell their project, landscape beautification project, as, oh, and by the way, we also did this for flood management. So they came off looking very well, although it was not, in fact, their intention at all. And secondly, there are still quite a number of canals in the historic city, so increasing their capacity as well. Although the problem is these canals, if you really look at them, they're actually blocked by water gates, both at beginning and end. So it's not like they're connected to the larger ecosystem, but so on. Next would be to increase the dike. And by the way, the dike that runs around Uchiha is actually the historic city wall. So doing that also incurred some raised eyebrows with the archaeologists, like, you're going to do what with the remnants of our ancient city wall? And then finally is to increase pumping. And so that's something I think everyone could agree upon. And so in theory, this combination of regional measures and localized measures, what was proposed, and to the credit of the Thai government, both inadvertently and advertently, they actually did, put in place some of these measures, although it wasn't done in a strategic manner, shall we say. And so that's kind of an anecdote about flooding at Ayutthaya. But in fact, the issue of landscape scale or territorial scale management also maybe is featured in another issue that is now being raised, and that's the construction of a high-speed rail, which, as you know, Thailand too is involved in this sort of giant high-speed rail construction, which goes through not just Thailand, but it goes through Laos, and eventually, well, it was supposed to go through Malaysia, but that was taken off the books, at least for now. And so among the many places it will traverse, the high-speed rail will just pass next to the historic city. And so you'll see on the right-hand side the alignment of the rail tracks, which, by the way, they would not be built anew. They would be built on top of an existing rail alignment that has been there actually for a century. But obviously they would be upgraded in order to accommodate for the high-speed rail. And similarly, the station, which now exists and actually is perhaps not of super high architectural significance, but still a historic building nonetheless, would also be affected because a new terminal would be built. And in fact, the planners, in perhaps a mistaken bid to try to protect the heritage of Ayutthaya, have decided that they'll keep the historic railway station and build this giant thing on top of it, because perhaps they've missed the point that the historic railway station is actually not maybe the important part of Ayutthaya. So, but a lot of acrobatic design gymnastics have been carried out in order to try to make this proposition work. but that's not so much, well, yes, the alignment is a concern, and yes, the station perhaps is not going to be such a visually pleasing one. But there's also another worry, which is that there is proposed to be a transit-oriented design real estate development that will encircle this upgraded station. And it's still a matter of debate how big this TOD will be. But in one version, actually this is the original version, you'll see that it not only will be on the eastern side of the river, but will also substantially ingress into the historic island as well. And so with this and the uncertainties of what the planning and urban design guidelines for this will be, raises a lot of questions. And you can see on the zoning map that, there is a very significant strip of it that will be zoned red, commercial, and then you've got residential. You've even got purple, which why is that purple? That's all of a cause of concern. And so so this kind of piecemeal approach, shall we say, to planning. In this case, the State Railway of Thailand has protested that the concerns about this proposed project are perhaps overblown, because at least according to their logic, the station is here, the rail line is here, but the World Heritage Site ends at half the island. So there's such a gap here, and you can't see the station from the core of the historic park. So, and it's been a great challenge to get them to understand that, well, yes, the World Heritage Site does end here, but everything else of the island is important as historic Ayutthaya. And not only that, but everything around the island is also the historic settlement as well. And so how to understand this broader view of what is significant and worthy of protection is something that continues to be an ongoing discussion. So when we take these two projects or these two kind of issues on board, and we look back at Ayutthaya, I mean, as someone was saying earlier, nothing is really new. I mean, this whole landscape has been engineered for 3-4 centuries. It's constantly been reworked. It's not like some pristine artifact. And you can see in this map, which is taken from a 1953 revision, but actually based on a very early survey from 1915, so now over a century ago, that the railway line already figures on this map. So and the street grid on the eastern side of the island already signals to us that from the very beginning of at least the administration of the modern Thai state, the eastern half of the island and the periphery of Ayutthaya has always been consigned to be development zone. And so in a sense, it's not like what's happening now is new, but what has changed is maybe the fact that we now have the benefit of things like the flood and so forth to remind us whether to begin to question whether this development trajectory that has been going on for a century has been the appropriate one for Ayutthaya as a site, as a landscape, both with natural as well as with historic qualities. And so, from a World Heritage point of view, where the sanctity of the most important thing is to protect the World Heritage Site, the thing that has been requested of the Thai government is to undertake a heritage impact assessment. So a heritage impact assessment is like an environmental impact assessment, except that the focus is on the impact on the heritage values and on the heritage components. And so this is underway, and within the guidelines for undertaking this heritage impact assessment, there is a very clear requirement to consider not just the site per se, but to understand the wider setting of the site. So in this case, the historic island, in this case, the periphery of Ayutthaya as well. And so I think this is necessary, and it's important that it gets done, and it may affect, hopefully in positive ways, the outcomes from the high-speed rail project. But at the same time, we know that when it gets to the stage of a heritage impact assessment or an environmental impact assessment, it's quite late. It's we're in many cases where it's too late to turn the ship around. So it's also quite reactive. So these are there are more fundamental questions that should have been asked maybe at the design stage or even at the planning stage. And so these are questions that unfortunately were not asked, at that kind of level of higher level planning. And so the heritage authorities had, when they put together the master plan for Utia, actually now over 2 decades ago, they very much saw Utia as being part of this larger landscape. And so the bit in brown is the area which is the World Heritage Site and gazetted. But then they also gazetted some years later the yellow part. But then they also designated all the areas around this. And you can see this is quite extensive as areas being of cultural and heritage significance as well. And so then you take this image and then you juxtapose it with the comprehensive plan for Utia province, which sees, for instance, which sees the historic island here all consigned to community, and then at its periphery, industrial development. It's a very different vision for what the future of Utia could be like. But thankfully, you'll see actually there's quite a lot of area that's zoned in green, whether it's for rural agriculture or for even rural conservation. And so I think there is also a recognition of the importance of the landscape within the planning process as well. And so when we look at all of the World Heritage management issues, especially those that are being tracked by the World Heritage Committee, you'll see that if we divide them at the level of scale, there are a number that are at regional scale, whether it's the flood risk issues or it's the land use planning issues. There are a number that are more at urban scale, like the high-speed rail projects or the revival of the ancient landscape within the city itself. And then, of course, there are things that are being raised as concerns at a monument scale, particularly the level of the quality of conservation. And so when we had our international experts come, one of them was from Venice, and he cautioned us at the very beginning that actually the flood is not so scary. What's scary is all the restoration work that comes after the flood. And indeed, the government gave an unprecedented budget allocation to Utia for the 1 fiscal year after the flood. And they had to use it all up in that 1 fiscal year. And they ended up restoring 100 monuments. And you can imagine what happens when you restore 100 monuments in 1 fiscal year. I don't even need to tell you. So as a corollary to those issues, sort of what is the planning response? And this I've derived from a course that we did where in fact Hong Kong U was one of the teams, in fact, but another team that was led by a consortium of Chinese universities. In this case, they're speaking about Nanjing, but it really could apply anywhere else. Suggested that, from the toolkit that we have now, which, if you're an archaeologist, is very much at the level of a pit or at the level of, an archaeological site. If you're if an architect, it's very much at the level of a building or at the very best a historic street. That we need to expand our toolkit of planning tools to be able to deal with things at a multi-scale level. So a regional level, sort of really large-scale land use planning, regional planning, city level, coordinating with transport and infrastructure and so forth, including disaster, neighborhood level, sort of the importance of maintaining the interface of streets and open spaces and so forth, and then finally architectural level. And for anyone sitting in this room, anyone who's taken any architecture courses or planning courses, this is so very obvious and so very basic. But then you look at what's happening in Utia and you wonder, like, where did people take all of their knowledge from school? Like, where did all that knowledge go? Because it's obviously not being applied. So if we take a step backwards and we think, so what is this multi-scale approach and so forth? In UNESCO speak, it would be maybe the management of cultural landscapes. And so 20 years after the World Heritage Convention was promulgated in 1972, and many Baroque churches and discrete monuments like the pyramids and the Great Wall and various specific buildings and so forth were listed as World Heritage Sites. obviously there became a greater recognition that, well, what about things that are not defined by a single monument or a single archaeological site? And this whole movement about, pushing for the protection of cultural landscapes as these contiguous territorial type things was put forth. And of course, it draws upon a longer time frame of people who have been thinking about landscapes and celebrating landscapes and defining landscapes and so forth. But from the point of view of international law, that it was embedded into the World Heritage process, and for good or for ill has now become a force for protecting and managing cultural landscapes around the world. And so, and when we think about some of the sites that have been enlisted, not in some cases, not necessarily by calling themselves as cultural landscapes, but being de facto cultural landscapes. One of these is Ban Chiang in northeastern Thailand. This is the dating varies, but it's anywhere between 5,000 or 7,000-year-old site, very famous as one of the very first, possibly the very first evidence of agricultural settlements in prehistoric times in Southeast Asia. And so they had tool making, they had pottery, they began to use metals, they domesticated animals and so forth. And Ban Chiang, as of 2000 BC and possibly older, was a settled mound, as you can see here. And to this day, it's still very recognizably a mound, 8 meters above mean sea level, and surrounded by paddy fields and agricultural land. And what's astonishing is that today, some 5,000 years later, after a continuous occupation from prehistoric times for about 2,000 years, then it was abandoned and it was resettled again in the 18th, 19th century, and then continuously occupied since then. What's amazing is you look at, and this is the Google map that I downloaded 3 days ago, it's still a mound occupied in the middle of an agricultural landscape, which still is legible and maintained as an agricultural landscape to this day, like 7,000 years ago, which I think, 7,000 years later, which I think is really astonishing as a feat of, if not planning will, then at least of neglect, So, but how do we, but that, and it's not a coincidence, right? That people continue to live here and people continue to farm here, and it says something about the quality of the land and the assets, the natural assets that are there, and the fact that there's water and that it's good land for farming and so forth. And so that it continues to be for a period of 5,000, 7,000 years, basically what it was, but with better TV and so forth. So, and then similarly in Malaysia, in the middle part of Malaysia, there is an archaeological site called the Lenggong Valley. And you can see in the images here, it has a fully intact burial, which dates from about 10,000 years ago. But in fact, this valley, the Lenggong Valley, has traces of human occupation dating back 2 million years. And so it is the earliest hominid site outside of Africa in Southeast Asia. And so, and the evidence that they have is from a meteor strike that struck in this valley and embedded stone tools into stone, which melted instantly on impact and turned into stone. So they were able to date it and then find that these hand tools went back 1.8 million years before present era. And then subsequent to that, there have been waves of occupation through the Paleolithic, the Neolithic, and then consequently through the various metal ages as well. And so, and there are traces in various parts of this valley, mostly clustered around two main clusters, but all tied to the Perak River, which is the longest river in peninsular Malaysia. And to this day, if one visits, as I did 2 weeks ago, continues to be an occupied valley, very quiet, and still perhaps not as visible or legible as Ban Chiang, as a settled mound, but certainly still continues more or less sort of, its DNA as an occupied valley. And so so when you're faced with the prospect of sustaining these sites that have been around for, in this case, 2 million years of continuous occupation, or in Banqiang, 7,000 years of continuous occupation. But then you're faced with the reality of the moment that we're in, which is, and this is a scholar attached to the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard who remarks, as these are his words, but everyone has said it before, we've experienced more drastic climate change than any other human has ever experienced, and there's no analogy in human history. We're at this stage of, anthropogenic pressures on the earth, where it's not just climate change, but it's like everything that we're doing now is accelerating change in a way that for 7,000 years, or for 2 million years, they've never faced this kind of pressure before. So the question is, what is our response, to this really pivotal and really apocalyptic moment in our history? Well, there are many, but one of UNESCO's responses would be is to think about planning in a very interconnected way, which again, as architecture or planning or landscape students, is sort of what you learn from day one, but again, doesn't translate into policy, and it certainly doesn't translate into practice. And so the very bottom left bubble here asks, how can future generations be engaged in maintaining the continuation of urban life? And you can see that in the layering of our understanding what the historic urban landscape is, but it applies very much to rural landscapes as well. It starts with the basic building blocks of geomorphology, hydrology. And so the situation at Ayutthaya really begs the question, if the geomorphology, if the hydrology had been taken as the essential conditions for planning at Ayutthaya, would you have planned one of Thailand's largest agglomerations of industrial estates right there? Would you have built, the various types of infrastructure that were built or not built there, to accommodate things like seasonal flooding, et cetera, and layered on top of these sort of, physical building blocks are, cultural practices, infrastructure, built environment, and so forth, with sort of, the traces of human trying to negotiate their way in this, natural environment. And so I end with a last bit from Luang Prabang, which is in sort of northern part of Laos, World Heritage Site as well. Many of the colleagues here have visited. In fact, Anna was there for several weeks just last year. And Luang Prabang again is a historic town. And you can see here in the slide that the World Heritage Site, well, at least the main part of it, is this peninsula that sits between the Mekong River on one side and the smaller Nam Khan River on this side. And the Nam Khan flows into the Mekong River. And but it's not just the historic town, but it's also the mountains on the other side of the river as well. And so, but it is mostly known as being this extremely charming fusion town, fusion in terms of its architecture and in terms of its town planning, a mix between French colonial town planning and the earlier indigenous Thai, not Thai like Thailand, but Thai like TAI, sort of ethnic group pattern of villages, which Thai villages are constructed as a series of villages on a spine. And so each village has its own temple. So if you've ever been to Luang Prabang and wondered why there are so many temples, it's because all these little villages each had their own temple. And then of course in Luang Prabang, there are royal temples as well. And they're all strung together in close proximity because they were all sort of in a linear arrangement along this peninsula between these two rivers, which by the way have mythical Naga serpents also living in the river. So this whole landscape is not just a natural landscape, but it's also a cosmological or a sacred landscape as well. And so in the protective mechanism for managing the heritage of Luang Prabang, the very first impetus was really from an architectural and an urbanistic point of view. So there is an exhaustive building inventory, but there also is an inventory of the urban wetlands, because there are a number actually of ponds that are interconnected and some of them not interconnected, that dot, as you can see in the picture, Luang Prabang, and it's part of sort of the ecology, but also the kind of social life of the town as well. But visitors to Luang Prabang will also remember and possibly be even more struck by sort of, the vibrancy of the culture, although it's been somewhat eroded in Luang Prabang. So the morning ritual of alms and merit making, which continues to this day. So I was in Luang Prabang earlier this month, and it was a Buddhist prayer day And what I realized, and my hotel was just across from 2 temples, and my bed was 7 meters away from the drum tower of one of the temples. And what I realized is during Buddhist prayer day, 3:45, the novices come to bang the drum, and they bang it for a long time. And then after they stop banging the drum, they start to play very loud pop music as a means to entice villagers to come and begin their morning, meditation and whatnot. And this goes on for some period of time, and then at the point when you finally fall asleep, and then the drums start up again at 6 in the morning. And so anyway, but you feel like you're really part of a living landscape when you're in this process where your entire bedroom is shivering in resonance with the drums. And but that is very much the charm of Luang Prabang, I think. And for people who civilians who are not architects maybe and not too interested in the built heritage, I think this is what really is memorable in visiting Luang Prabang. But it's not just the rivers, and it's not just the living heritage, but it's also the setting of Luang Prabang, not just to the buildings and living heritage, but it's also the setting and the life of people that's intertwined with the river as well. So we have the Mekong River, we have the Nam Khan River, and in the middle of the slide, you'll see that villagers have had a practice of farming on the riverbanks, and there are certain types of vegetation that are cultivated and are indicator species for the quality of the water as well. Particularly this is not farmed, but it's a river weed, which is harvested from the Mekong, and it really only grows if the water is clean and is passing through. But the river is also the site of sacred ceremonies. So during the Lao New Year's in April, people will go down to sand dunes that appear in the middle of the Mekong and construct these ritual sand stupas as well. So living with the rivers is part and parcel of the life of Luang Prabang. And if you look on these aerial images, this one from 1991, just at the cusp of World Heritage inscription, you'll see, for instance, well, of course, the urban pattern, but also sort of the sand dunes that are part of the river here at the mouth of the Nam Khan as it meets the Mekong, and here in the middle of the Nam Khan. And these sand dunes come and go. Of course, they're seasonal. They come with the different patterns of water and sedimentation. But you'll see that in 1995, shortly after that, so that one at the mouth is no longer there. It's a different time of year, but the one in the middle of the Nam Khan is still there. But as of a few weeks ago when I was there, this one is gone, and it's gone permanently. And this one, permanently gone. And this one looks like a sand dune, but it's actually constructed from riprap to replace the sand dune, which had been permanently engulfed by the dam, which is 70 kilometers downstream of Luang Prabang. And so this is a permanent change in the ecological setting of Luang Prabang. But it's also a permanent change in the way that people access and interact with the rivers as well, because on the one hand, yes, you could construct a faux sand dune out of riprap, but does it fulfill the same functions from a social, from a ecological, etc. point of view or not? These are open questions. And part of the reason that this sand dune has permanently disappeared is like a cascade, which is a series of dams that has been constructed on the Nam Khan River upstream. So everyone in the news worries about all the mainstream Mekong dams, of which there are several, but no one is giving attention to tributary dams, and there are many in Laos alone. And so this is the latest mainstream Mekong dam, which is unfortunately named Luang Prabang Dam. Unfortunately, because it was named Luang Prabang Dam, among other things, it made people like UNESCO sit up and pay attention and write lots and lots of letters to the Lao government asking about how this dam is going ahead and what kinds of impact assessments are being conducted with the dam. But it's not just the one dam. In this case, the Luang Prabang Dam actually is 25 kilometers far away from the site, but it still will have an impact. And the question is what that impact will be, and is it acceptable or not? And so the report that was issued by the Mekong River Commission, which is known not to be the most rigorously technically critical organization, itself even says the potential inundation of Luang Prabang under a dam break or severe flood operations, would basically be catastrophic, as you can see here, almost, entirely inundated. The question is for how long, right? So at Ayutthaya, people said it's not the flooding that's the problem. It's the fact that it was there for 6 weeks. That's the problem. The water comes and the water goes. The impact is not so great. But if the water is there for a while, it causes all sorts of problems. And so, but it's not just this one dam. So as we know, there's a series of dams. And the downstream dam, for instance, is the one that has actually permanently engulfed this festival sand dune, which has now been rebuilt with riprap. And so how do we, sort of puzzle our way out of this situation? The existing management approach at Luang Prabang already, well, as you can see, this is the World Heritage designation. It is to the credit of the people who, created this demarcation that they saw beyond the historic peninsula, which is in red here, but they saw also the importance of the attached urban area, but also of the area beyond, across the river, which is Jompet district, and it's this mountain range, which is across the river. So they were taking sort of a larger view of what Luang Prabang is. And in fact, but beyond that, there is now increasing pressure. And in fact, a larger protective designation has been put in place beyond that purple boundary, but now there's a buffer zone. But now we are realizing, because the dam is still some 20 kilometers away from the buffer zone, then it's really not adequate just to have this buffer zone, which maybe would be sufficient for urban planning purposes or future settlement purposes, but is not adequate for environmental or large-scale infrastructure concerns. And by the way, the high-speed rail station, of course, is actually in this bit right here. So Luang Prabang 2 has a high-speed rail station. It's away from the historic town, but it's certainly within the footprint of the urban area. So how do we think about all of this? I mean, I think in Luang Prabang now, the Lao government, with support from various partners, is trying to take steps to widen its understanding and definition of what the heritage of Luang Prabang is, away from just the built heritage, to also take into consideration living heritage, to also take into consideration environmental heritage as well. But all of these emerging issues, whether it's disaster risk management, whether it's climate change and so forth, these are all still, fairly new from a policy making or from a planning point of view. And so, our management responses will have to necessarily continue to evolve. And evolve within this framework where we're not just trying to sustain the heritage resources per se, but we're trying to move to the next step where we see that the thing is, national policymakers, there are not that many people who really are interested in heritage. Heritage is very much a third-rate concern. And if you ever go to any government Ministry of Culture, you'll see the stark contrast between what a Ministry of Culture looks like and what a Ministry of Foreign Affairs looks like. And that tells you everything about, the priority that culture is accorded in the national government planning system. And so when you make the case for, look, we've got to protect the heritage because it's important, because it's, iconic, because it's, et cetera, there are not that many high-ranking officials who are really going to pay attention, beyond lip service. But if that said, it was still a major achievement to get culture and heritage specifically in the Sustainable Development Goals, and it was absolutely ignored in the Millennium Development Goals, if you recall. It wasn't, like, not even once did it appear. And so now having a foothold in the Sustainable Development Goals allows it to be an issue that is raised at a global level, but also at a national level and even subnational level, because there's a lot of pressure to try to localize the SDGs. And so SDG Target 11.4, of course, talks about safeguarding the world's cultural and natural heritage. But beyond that, I mean, as a kind of a planning proposition, it's looking at it the other way and thinking about how to mobilize heritage for sustainable development in a way which is beyond just the culture sector or the environmental sector or protecting heritage for the sake of heritage, but really how does heritage answer to poverty alleviation? How does heritage support health care goals? How does heritage improve the quality of education? How does culture and nature, ensure the sustainability of our cities and so forth? So it's this larger dialogue which requires really flipping the way that culture, heritage, the environment are presented, is probably the only way forward in terms of really ensuring that this relationship between heritage and sustainability can be carried out in the long term. So with that, I know I've far overrun my allotted time, so I'll wrap it up and be very pleased to take questions from Ashley and anybody else. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Montira, for this wonderful talk. Before I actually introduce our discussant tonight, I just want to make an announcement that this lecture is actually can be taken as a CPD credit hours for HKILA, Hong Kong Institute of Landscape Architect, and also HKICon. So we will put these two forms at the corner of the room. So for those who want to claim this lecture as the CPD credits, please remember to sign when you leave the room. So I would like to now introduce our discussant of tonight, Ashley Scott Kelly, who is an assistant professor in the Division of Landscape Architecture. Ashley is a landscape planner and expert in the geographic information system with research and practice focusing on scenario building and filling knowledge gaps for sustainable development, especially in regions that lack adequate knowledge or transparency in development information and spatial data. Ashley lectures widely and have actively engaged with development agencies across South and Southeast Asia. He has coordinated the master thesis in landscape architecture for 5 years and teaches design courses on regional landscape planning in China, South and Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Ashley, please take it away.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you, Montira, for the excellent talk. I realize that we're running quite close to time. We have about 15 minutes on the original schedule, so I'm going to try my best to try and wrap all of my questions up into one for the sake of time, and that primarily concerns a theme that I felt recurring over and over again in your talk, which was effectively on how to be strategic when talking and doing heritage practice. So I think that there is an assumption, and you said it in your talk yourself, that in studios with our students, in school, there's somewhat of an assumption that heritage matters are important to planning, right? You said it's so very obvious in your talk. But UNESCO and you are going through a significant effort on the ground to try to weave heritage concerns across scales and development sectors. Case in point, the large dams on the Mekong at the very end. I was just chatting with Montira before the lecture tonight, and we were talking about Luang Prabang, and apparently recently there was a set of special economic zones that were cancelled. And these were about 125 square kilometers that ringed the entire World Heritage property. And in our studios, we've had our students look at the original master planning documents that were drawn up at South China University of Technology's Architectural Institute. And heritage generally is not present really in any of those plans. So you can chime in.
Chalets are. One of the amenities proposed in these special economic zones is an area of Swiss chalet.
So an initial thought is, well, even coming from an academic institution, where is it? Where it's not present. It's mostly commercialized. It's mostly focused on tourism. But then we get into, going through you had a slide on assessing impacts in the wider setting of the heritage site, and that's the one, probably the most challenging slide out of all of the ones you presented, where there was a project 1, a project 2, the scope of the bubbles is kind of enveloping each other, and then the heritage properties, at the middle. And that made me think a lot about the evolution of the environmental impact assessment process in terms of, first you had an EIA, and then you had cumulative assessment, and then you had strategic environmental assessment, these things that are constantly trying to widen the scope. But a lot of criticisms of impact assessment are that the scope is set by planners, actually, throughout the process. They're the very same people, that are doing those plans and projects. It's an impossible question, but what kinds of knowledge do you think you need to know as a heritage professional in order to be strategic in practice? As a you said your spiritual home was landscape, or should have been. And normally we try and draw from almost an ecological science base. We retreat into it somewhat to be strategic, and then we weave it in with culture and other things. So in your practice, what knowledge do you draw from in order to be strategic?
I mean, I guess there's like sort of tactical approaches, in terms of, building coalitions of the willing and the not so willing and so forth. But maybe I'll give an example by the work that we're doing in Laos now, at a national level. This is not the only project, obviously, which is raising eyebrows in terms of potential impacts on heritage and Laos. There are several other, including another dam, even closer to another World Heritage Site. And so running after the cart, one project at a time is not going to cover longer term cumulative impact in another way. So we're working at a regulatory level in order to try to put in place stronger safeguard mechanisms for development projects, including infrastructure development and other types of development. But there are multiple strands to approach it. One strand is to work with the planning and investment at a very high level. When they screen investment projects and they have a checklist of environmental, social, and so forth concerns, heritage is absent from this checklist. So getting it in that kind of checklist at a very high, very upstream level, the investor comes with a business plan to propose to the government, and do they get the concession area or not? So that's one strand. Another strand is within the EIA system itself. To strengthen the EIA system, which, yes, it seems to be hijacked, yes, tends to be reactive, yes, tends to be too late, but still, it's necessary people who can't not deal with it. And so putting heritage into that agenda is important. Another way is to put heritage into the planning agenda, like the spatial planning agenda as well. And it's not there now. Part of it is because, and it's quite true, at least in the context of Laos, there's not a very good idea of where the heritage is and what constitutes heritage. So planners, even if they're well-meaning, don't have any legal or other kinds of baseline knowledge to be able to say, oh, this is an important part. Maybe it's visible, but maybe it's just archaeological potential or high archaeological potential. So putting in place that kind of knowledge system is important, but also putting in place the spatial planning mechanisms that allow heritage to be more grounded in planning processes. So I think it operates at all of these different levels, and as you can see, it operates across different ministries and partners and entities, including the private sector. That was Ashley's question.
Since we only have 10 minutes left, which is
I'm going
I think it's recording.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting to hear, especially about Ayutthaya and the flooding history, and especially with the 2011 floods. Something that's I'm really interested in also with, I guess, thinking about strategy, right, and strategicness. I'm curious how working with the Thai government shifted from 2011 to later on under Prayu and the NCPO, and how that altered or impacted in some ways the mitigation of flooding issues and stuff in not only Ayutthaya but also Bangkok, and yeah, how that changed.
If you've ever been to Thailand as a tourist and you go to the night markets, you'll see this T-shirt where it says same but different. That's my answer. Same but different. Not to be flippant, but it really is that way. I mean, as I mentioned, that one of the things that happened, and not necessarily because of the government, but there's this office of national water resource management, which is a kind of overall coordinating arm. There's a new law in place, and the new National Water Management Law Act. Actually. And one of the things this act does is set up the new governance mechanisms for water management. So there are, for instance, river basin coordination committees. And so it's not done by province and it's not done by region, but it's done by river basin. So every major river basin has a coordination committee, which is meant to anticipate these issues and put in place adequate planning mechanisms and so forth. And so the act was passed, I think it's not that long ago, about 18 months or so ago. So everything is sort of still in its early stages. But at least the kind of the overall governance mechanisms are, at least on paper, improved. Whether that filters down into the actual negotiations. So, for instance, the eastern part of Thailand, when we look at hydrological kind of forecasts, every forecast says there's enough water, but if you go and ask the farmers, they say there's not enough water. So what is this disconnect between macro level, forecasts that are constructed from remote sensing data and from climate change, forecasts and so forth, and the lived reality on the ground of farmers who feel that their water is being taken away to industrial areas. So there are these tensions that remain unresolved, and then strangely enough, the same water authority that says that there's enough water is also proposing 36 mega projects that are all about diverting water from here to there and there to here and so forth. So if there's enough water, then why are we, funding 36 mega projects to do all of this massive water moving around? So there are, even within the government's own narrative, own policy making tensions.
I hope some of my students are here because we're going to visit one of those diverting projects in just a few days. Any other questions? Yes, Creighton.
Hi, so a really interesting talk. I have a bit more of a conceptual question. So your talk was titled The Territorial View on Heritage and Sustainability, but as you mentioned, a lot of the UNESCO lingo uses this landscape term as connecting nature, culture, people, and so on. So do you think there's need to kind of shift some of that language to using territory as a concept instead, or do you think that they're both concepts are useful in different ways?
I don't know if you've heard of ICCROM, but it's the International Conservation and Training Center that's based in Rome. And it was set up as an arm to the World Heritage Convention and as an advisory body for cycle to be. And for many years, from like the mid-70s until onwards, they ran an architecture conservation course. And then at the time when these issues of sustainability began to be important from Stockholm and so forth, we decided to change the course to a course called ITUC, or Integrated Territorial and Urban Conservation. So to shift the scale from architecture to territorial and urban. And I think and more recently, the term cultural landscape has come into vogue. So I think this is an issue, I don't want to say it's just an issue of semantics, because there are important nuances between territory and landscape. And I think landscape perhaps has more a sense of nature somehow embedded, at least from the understanding of the man on the street. So I don't know if there's a right answer to say, but I think the important thing is that we're looking at a larger scale, and the important thing is that we're looking at nature as part of this dialogue.
Yes.
Montira, that was very inspiring. The question I have in mind is nature fighting back from where it clearly is? What difference might that make in these same but different? What's the time phrase for that? Same?
I think it only exists as pidgin English.
Same but different. Actually, it's not, is it anymore? So the post, well, I was in Bangkok during that flood, and I also was I got quite nostalgic because I used to work in about the old times. But things have changed, and in our environmental assessments and in the projective planning that everybody has always done, might there actually now be a shift from growth-oriented planning to constraints-oriented planning, for example? There might be the potential financial costs, or which will inevitably be priced into the bottom line of those investors that you talked about that you have to get to very early stage. Will be priced in environmental risks of floods if we build here in this one. So that can eventually shift the power. So nature does have the last laugh in many ways, at least compared to the 20th century.
So my father owned some land that he bought as a young man, where Bangkok meets the sea, it meets the Gulf. And what is, this new low-lying delta area. And that whole area has been subject to major coastal erosion. And the water is brackish, so if you look at it, he doesn't really own land, he owns water. But this patch of water that he owns is now part of a neighborhood that has recently been rezoned red. And so his neighbors are building mini polders and filling in their water in order to construct cafes and other things. Which is completely ironic because every day you hear on the news about the sea making greater incursions into this area. And so they've just rezoned an area that is soon to be the Gulf of Thailand red. So where's the planning logic there? So in Thailand, I think the national conversation has not gone towards degrowth yet, as has been happening in other countries or other cities, where this issue has come to the fore, and planners are realizing, not just spatial planners, but economic planners as well, realizing that degrowth is maybe necessary for survival. But the conversation about decarbonization is there, and the government has made commitments, at least rhetorically, at the previous COP and the most recent COP as well, in order to get to net zero in a decade's time. So I think that the pressure at the global level from that, the realization within the private sector, at least of meeting these ESG net zero type of goals, I think that is beginning to move the needle, at least conceptually, in ways of doing things in terms of investment and so forth. And so I think there will be some changes. but conversation towards growth is not yet happening. And I think would be really that's the word I know. Who are like representative things that people that are heretical. Yeah, it would be really heretical to say that in a national planning conversation. Because then if you look at like if you track the news since COVID, Thailand is 20% of the labor force dependent on tourism before COVID. We had 40 million arrivals before COVID, and last year we had 4 by mid-year and 10 by the end of the year. The Prime Minister himself went in person to welcome visitor number 10 million at the airport. But 10 million and 40 million is very different. But if you read all of the national conversation about tourism, it's all about recovery, and it's not about finding alternatives. Not like, gee, maybe we're too dependent on tourism, we need to find like other industries. Maybe this needs to be a sunset industry. So, extractive, and it causes so much environmental damage and social, has so many social externalities. So no, it's all about, well, how do we get the Chinese tourists back, and what things can we attract them with, and maybe it needs to be spa tourism and whatnot, it's absolutely in blinkers. That's why when I mentioned, when I answered previous question, was same thing. That's on that somber note.
We have time for one more? Okay. So another question? Okay. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I want to, because we're talking about earlier the silos, the different agencies that don't talk to each other. I see this also in other parts of Southeast Asia. What's your best guess of what's like an embedded thing that causes all of this the non-integration of the different groups, different bodies within the government or within even the private sector that's causing all of this? I'm trying, not all, but substantially problem of all of this environmental.
I think the problem of silos is ubiquitous. Every country, every milieu has this problem, and nature, is it the fact that everyone wields a different law and wants to be the owner of that law, and you want to be the master of your own administrative fiefdom, and why should I have a conversation with someone else who has his own fiefdom? But I think there are, so the answer is always to have coordinating bodies and things, but you've heard the adage, if you want to not solve a problem, then set up a committee, right? So, but what other mechanisms are there? Some of the mechanisms might be to have larger, higher upstream visioning type processes, which become at least the kind of a common direction, at least that different sectors and different entities can move towards. If the vision comes out from an experience of negotiation and so forth, and it does have some teeth. And that's actually the first step in the toolkit for putting in place, planning within the historic urban landscape framework, is precisely to do a kind of a joint visioning process. And cities that have taken on the historic urban landscape as a planning approach, for instance, Ballarat in Australia, historic mining town, have precisely put in place a visioning process. And again, it's not new, and planners have been doing visioning decades. And it has been effective as a mechanism of creating the pretense of doing it itself, not the pretext, but like the pretext of doing it in itself creates a mechanism for dialogue that would not, whether it's sincere and whether it's effective is not another question, but at least having that dialogue is most cases probably better than not.
Okay, so I think before we give our applause to Montira, I think Natalia has a few words that she wants to.
Before we leave, I want to show. Just want to announce the next lectures. We're having one on Thursday, which is going to be online, and there will be a registration, and that's Man Barrow Barua, who is geographer. So to continue with our multidisciplinary lecture series, he'll be lecturing on the macaques in Delhi. And it's a really interesting story. It will be at 6:30 online, so you'll need to register for that. For the rest of the lecture series, we have on March 14th, we have Peter Venstra from Lola Landscape Architects, and that will be face-to-face here. The next one is Richard Engelhardt, who's a visiting professor currently in conservation. He is lecturing in Tycoon, so there will be an email sending out registration for that in the next few weeks. And lastly, we have Gunther Vogt from ETH Zurich. He's the director of Vogt Landscape Architects and the chair of landscape architecture at ETH, and he'll be lecturing on April 19th. And this lecture is co-organized with M+. So just you'll keep getting our emails.
Thank you.
To remind you when they are, but just note that everything is in a different, like we have a different venues, so that's important.
Thanks for innocent plug. And with that, let's thank Montira for her fantastic. Okay, so we're going to say